you've been quite emotional about this case. Do you still feel that same raw emotion? Do you feel like you're really fighting this for these young people?
I think we always feel the emotion. You know, I'm a fairly emotional individual. You know, if you've been around me and you get to know me, I am that way because I care, and I care a lot.
Hey guys, it's Vanessa from Unmasked. We finally have an arrest, which I'm sure was extremely bittersweet for the families, but it almost seems like it's made all of the speculation and frenzy around this case even more intense. That clip is from a short but great interview on News Nation. I've linked the full interview from News Nation in the description below. I know that not everyone may agree, but I am personally a huge fan of Chief Fry. I wasn't at first, but he was under an immense amount of pressure. And I think that the fact that they had to keep everything so close to the vest with the huge, just overwhelming worldwide interest, and the fact that these murders were so shocking and brought so much rage out among the public caused a lot of undue anger and speculation that the Moscow PD wasn't doing things properly. I did have faith and believe from the beginning that with 50 and then 60 FBI agents on this, that they knew what they were doing and that nothing was being done by accident, and that every single thing happening and every piece of information that was being released was very strategic and intentional. I've spent the past few days since the arrest going back to the very beginning, going back through everything, and then just combining it with what we know now and just my opinion. But I do feel like both investigators and the alleged killer were engaging back and forth in some cat and mouse games. Before we get started, please hit the like, subscribe, and notification bell set to all. These 3 things help creators immensely. Also, please share this video everywhere you can. I absolutely love hearing from you guys and love seeing your comments below. I've had some amazing comments and very insightful comments in the last video and in my shorts on this case. I just ask that you stay respectful, of course, above all to the victims. Keep it respectful to me and the other commenters. Of course, as we all know by now, Pennsylvania native Bryan Kohberger was arrested on Friday for the murders of Kaylee, Maddie, Xana, and Ethan on November 13th in Moscow, Idaho. Since the very short time since his arrest, all kinds of information has been emerging about the 28-year-old PhD student at Washington State. Despite taking into account that each person knows Kohberger in a different capacity from varying times in his life, it seems pretty universal that he is seen as very socially awkward, not extremely friendly, and not someone who respects boundaries. These descriptions have come from people that knew him from high school all the way up to current acquaintances. Okay, so there's so many things that I find interesting. I don't even know how I'm going to break this down. I'm going to get into the game playing, I think, that was done. I have so many examples. And then the next video, I'll kind of go a little bit deeper into some of the things I found today. However, the first thing that really caught my attention was that Bryan did go back to class that Monday right after the murders. So right off the bat, you're thinking, okay, did he have any injuries? It doesn't sound like he most likely did. If he was able to go back to class, he didn't call in sick. That would have looked very suspicious anyway, but it would have been hard to hide anything to the face. And even though it's wintertime and it's cold outside, he's not going to wear gloves during class, so any major cuts to his hands would also have been noticeable, in my opinion, unless he tried to just kind of keep them in his pockets or out of sight for a couple of days. But I do find that interesting. So anyone that came in contact with him in those few days after the murders, it would be fascinating to know if he did have any, looking back, if he had any scratches, bruises, cuts on his face, on his hands, because my guess is that he didn't. And if he did, they weren't noticeable. So right off the bat, that's fascinating. Now, I do think it's important to note that there were a few people that did say that he seemed very disheveled, not really himself, and disengaged in class after the murders. And No, I'm not comparing him to Ted Bundy. That's not what we're doing here. But when you have studied serial killers, some things just kind of jump out to you. It reminded me a little bit of the descriptions of Ted Bundy when he was in law school and he was killing at night and he couldn't balance the two. His dark was taking over the rest of him and he did start to look very disheveled. He also started to just lose focus and fail out of class. So just an interesting side note. Kohberger has been described as exceptionally bright. I mean, he's highly educated. There's some irony in all this, just by some of the mistakes that it appears that were made. But in my opinion, let's talk about the very first thing that most of us came across that just gave us chills. He was on Reddit under the username Criminology Student and was actually conducting a study asking ex-cons to participate. The study was to understand how emotions and psychological traits influence decision-making when committing a crime. It also came out that Kohberger was randomly following students around the library and it became almost a nuisance, asking them to fill out another questionnaire on empathy. So if you combine that with the personality traits that we're hearing from people that knew him, in my opinion only, he was trying to plan out the perfect crime. So maybe in his mind and on paper, he had everything worked out, but what he didn't account for is that plans go wrong. My personal theory is that when he got into that house, he did not account for any of the victims to wake up and start fighting back. He also didn't seem to account for the risk of using his own vehicle with Pennsylvania plates to speed away from the scene and possibly be picked up on camera. So this leads me directly into the cat and mouse games and also the multiple accounts on social media platforms that many people believe could be Kohberger. This seems to be a very polarizing topic right now. I'm not sure what the big deal is or why so many people are quick to just squash it without having a conversation. I'm definitely not going to dox anyone because at this time it's just speculation. But I have read every single one of the comments and reviewed the accounts, and I think there are some things worth discussing. First, we know from history that many killers love to brag and taunt police about their crimes and be active in the investigations. Second, every profiler I've watched on this case has alluded to the fact that this guy would be all over social media. Okay, so there is one account on Reddit that has a lot of speculation around it, and it is interesting for many reasons. It was tipped into the FBI multiple times for weeks prior to Kohberger's arrest. Not only is this sheer number of comments interesting, but it's his arrogance and just definitive statements on the details of the murders. The other thing is, unlike the rest of us, his statements about the details never change from the time of the murders to the last time he posted, which coincidentally was the night before the SWAT team arrested Bryan Kohberger. Now, there's a ton of comments. I'm not going to give the name because I don't want to piss anyone off or make anyone feel like I'm doxing anyone, that's having a private conversation in there. All it takes is a Google search. It's not that difficult to find. So let's talk about some of the most interesting comments that were made by this account. This account confidently asserts that the killer parked right behind the house and then came down through the tree line. He said that the killer would have entered through the sliding door, left it open behind him, and that the killer entered at 3:20 a.m. and left at 3:40 a.m. He stated that Xana and Maddie were the actual targets, and that after the killer entered the house, he went directly to Xana's room. He also commented that the killer brought the knife with him and left with it, and that it did not break during the murders. He also stated definitively that the killer was not injured because of the design of the knife. This person seemed to confirm what the coroner said, that all 4 victims were sleeping when he first entered the house. He also commented that Kaylee was the very last victim and that the downstairs bathroom may have been used by the killer. When asked why the other 2 roommates were left alive, he commented that the killer was satisfied with the number 4. He also stated that he was constantly checking, looking for a person of interest, and he also made a comment that being on the run wasn't very fun. He did ask some people to DM him, and some of the people that spoke with him commented that as it got closer to the arrest, he did almost seem to become a little more anxious, lose some of his cockiness, and even went back to change some of his comments to say, "in my opinion," or "I'm just speculating." He also mentioned 4chan on some of his comments, and I know that some of the 4chan stuff was debunked, but it did make me think of that picture that was posted on 4chan that people were arguing, could that be Kaylee? It has a timestamp of 3:10 a.m. And then if you take what this person said as he entered at 3:20 a.m., I don't know, it's just kind of interesting. And before anyone leaves me a comment like, "Vanessa, these have all been debunked, were you dropped on your head as a child?" Please actually drop a link to show me a concrete place that this has been debunked. If it's just your opinion that it's been debunked, then that's really no different than my opinion that it hasn't. However, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I'm not sure what to think about the sliding door versus the window still. I do know that investigators also seem to pay a lot of attention to that window, and there was a TikTok on roommate Leah Sullivan's account that is now private, but at the very beginning it was public, where they went on a tour of the house and they did mention that the kitchen window did not have a screen and that the lock was broken. So anyone watching their social media would have seen that. As far as Maddie and Xana being the targets, that has a lot of people speculating, does that mean that the connection is from the Mad Greek restaurant where Maddie and Xana worked together? We know that Bryan is described as being OCD about being vegan, and when you Google best vegan restaurants in Moscow, Idaho, the Mad Greek comes up first. However, I do think at this point it's almost impossible to pinpoint exactly how he came across the victims. I randomly noticed the other day on Kaylee's Insta, she follows a coffee shop that is less than a mile from Bryan's apartment. There's just so many possibilities. Also, as far as cat and mouse games go, I also believe that investigators were using the mainstream media and social media to send messages to the killer as well. As I went back through all of the old interviews and timelines, I started to pick up things that I didn't notice before. I do think that investigators had Bryan as a suspect long before the arrest, but were building a case and waiting for forensics to come back. Of course, this is just my opinion, but I remember that investigators stated that they had the footage from Linda Lane right by the crime scene from the day after the murders. That footage had the white Elantra driving by between 2:45 and 3:15 a.m. It also would have captured Bryan's Pennsylvania plates, most likely. Now, it's been discovered that Bryan did go and change his plates from Pennsylvania to Washington plates on November 18th, 5 days after the murders, but I personally think it was too late. That would also leave a record at the DMV with that transaction, and I think that would be highly suspicious to investigators. I also noticed looking back that for weeks, reporters had asked investigators over and over why there was no reward being offered, and they were almost coy with their answers back that they had so many helpful tips from the public that they didn't need one. Investigators made the white Elantra public on December 7th, and Bryan left to go back to Pennsylvania less than a week later. As we now know, his father flew out to Washington and made the long drive back to Pennsylvania with him. I don't think Bryan had any intention of returning to Washington with that vehicle. The very next day after they made the white Elantra public, they announced that they would be reducing the amount of investigators assigned to the case. To me, that made absolutely no sense if they didn't have any suspects and there was a dangerous killer on the loose. So as we know, Bryan is on his way back to Idaho tomorrow, and it will be interesting to see if we get any additional information from investigators. I know we are all very anxiously awaiting the release of the probable cause affidavit, and that will hopefully be released soon. I will continue to follow every aspect of this case all the way through. Much love to the families of the victims. I can't imagine what they're going through, and we are all here behind you wanting justice for Kaylee, Maddie, Xana, and Ethan. So I'd love to hear your thoughts and comments about whether or not you think that Bryan was on social media and if any of these accounts could possibly be him. I'd also love to hear your thoughts on what the police were releasing and if you think they knew about him long before we did. Thank you guys so much for watching. Stay safe and see you next video.